Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for bearing with the shift of venue. This room has a somewhat different feel to it, and we'll try to bear with the different acoustics as well as the seating arrangement. It's really a great pleasure to be with you again this morning to continue our discussion of many of these important topics that we started on in the past 2 days. I'd like to begin, as I typically do, with a retrospective, reflecting a little bit on what we've encountered, particularly yesterday. Putting it into context, and then I'd like to go on to discuss some of what lies before us today. So yesterday, we began the day with introducing the first of several methods that we are going to be applying here in the course of the week. And specifically, we looked at a method that's notable in terms of its simplicity, its capacity to be applied in different fashions, including an unsupervised fashion where we can induce or abduct the model from the available data. And that was hidden Markov models. I argued that hidden Markov models were only arguably a system science techniques, system science dealing with these systems where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, almost always non-linear, because with linear systems, there's very much an ability to reason from the parts directly to the whole. But within system science, a central point of interest is in the use of dynamic models, models which characterize some underlying situation that evolves over time. And while that first type of modeling that we examined, hidden Markov modeling, was not a strong case of a system science model, it was very notably a dynamic model, a model where we have some depicted state. As we say, it's latent in the sense that we typically can't observe it directly, but it's evolving over time. And it's evolving, in fact, according to a linear process, where each state has a certain probability of transitioning to each other state. Within the hidden Markov model context, there's this underlying latent state, and we're interested in inferring what it is and in understanding the patterns of transition between its different states. But we do so, as we typically do in the world, with very, very imperfect information. Our inferences about the world and our inferences in hidden Markov models are stymied by the fact that we're dealing with information that we observe that's incomplete, doesn't tell us the full story for sure. It merely hints often at the underlying situation. It's often ambiguous. Any given reading will give some uncertainty about its real implications. And yet we're trying to probe this key underlying situation that's of such importance. This is the situation with hidden Markov models. And in some cases, the data that we're observing is only intermittently available. So a lot of the time we may not have information. And situations like this surround us. whether it's a mechanical problem in our car, we hear this occasional noise and we're not quite sure what it means. It could mean, the car fan belt is acting up, or it could mean that there's something in the engine mechanism that really needs to be fixed urgently. We're often left guessing about what the underlying situation is because we have this ambiguous data. If we're dealing with people on youth at risk, and we hear comments that we're not quite sure how to take, we worry because it may indicate an underlying issue of concern, or it may be overblown and we're misreading it. So often in the world, we have some underlying situation that we're trying to probe, and the data that we have is highly imperfect, incomplete, sparse often, highly ambiguous, noisy. Needless to say, this is true in big ways about data at the aggregate level, but also at the individual level. And we saw yesterday how we could use a hidden Markov model to infer, according to certain algorithms. We noted essentially four big types of calculations. One was calculation of a likelihood that a model would yield some sequence of observation over time. But we also had a forward-backward algorithm that calculated at any one time what's the probability we're in each underlying state. A state perhaps of suicidal ideation of concrete nature versus non-concrete suicidal ideation versus non-suicidal at all. Or perhaps it's an outbreak versus non-outbreak state for Saskatoon. These are different inference tasks with different underlying situations, but the forward-backward algorithm would allow us to put a probability on being in each of those states for a particular model. The third algorithm we looked at yesterday was the Viterbi algorithm. What that gives us is a picture over time of the single most likely sequence. So it tells us not just at this time the probability of being in each of the states is such and such, but what's the single most likely story that's played out in terms of, this person was initially did not have suicidal ideation, and then at this point they may have developed non-concrete suicidal ideation. They briefly escalated to concrete, but then fell back to non-concrete, persisted in that for a while, and then quickly engaged in concrete and attempted suicide. It gives us that story for that person that's most likely. Sort of a Viterbi algorithm would give. And we finally mentioned the Baum-Welch algorithm. I actually didn't introduce it formally. I sort of made mention to it and waved my hands at it, but fundamentally it consists of an algorithm by which we could, and Jeff will have to correct me if I misuse the term, abduct the structure, or excuse me, the transition probabilities in the model based on observed data. Abduct not in a criminal justice sense, of course, but in the sense of Peirce, Charles Peirce, of whom Jeff could speak with some length. So here we're dealing with four different algorithms that can help take a hidden Markov model and give us information about it. The last one, we're actually deducing a hidden Markov model. We saw there's another technique, maximum likelihood estimation, which basically allows us to try to probe what's the likely structure of this model that's given rise to the data. Where, given such a model, we can apply that. Given such a model, we can get its likelihood of having produced the data. That's how we find the most likely model. And then given that model as well, we can ask about the single most likely sequence of underlying states that would account for the data we do see. And we would be able to ask at a given time, what's the probability of being a different state through the forward backward output. Hidden Markov models are very, very useful. And like many types of machine learning tools, we apply them in different ways. So we had what's called a supervised learning way of building them, where we actually have a privileged knowledge for a few cases sometimes of so-called labeled data or ground truth data. We know what the underlying situation is, and we use it to build a hidden Markov model that captures those patterns as parsimoniously as possible. Knowing the underlying situation, we can deduce the transition probabilities between states. We can deduce what the so-called emission matrices are, the probability of observing something given being in a state. And we can then take that model and use it to probe other data where we don't know the privileged situation. That's supervised learning. We have this privileged set of data that allows us a shortcut for building the model. In unsupervised learning, by contrast, we have some underlying data, and we're looking for a model that most parsimoniously explains it, with the understanding that we might then use that model for very different sorts of data as well. So there was supervised and unsupervised learning, and with supervised learning where we do know the underlying situation, there's a training phase and an evaluation phase where we use some of the labeled data to train the model and some of it to judge it. And we often do that in a round robin sort of way called cross-validation, where we're looking for a model that has generalizability. We train it in one set, we test it on the others, and we're looking for a model that does well in both and isn't overfit to the original data. Those were hidden Markov models, but they taught us some principles, hopefully, that carried over to our coverage in the afternoon of a very important topic that will stay with us today. And that is the topic of particle filtering. Hidden Markov models were specific to a case of very simple character. Number one, we had discrete states, typically categorical in nature. So we're non-outbreak or outbreak, say in one case. Or another one, we might label someone as being non-suicidal ideation, non-concrete suicidal ideation, concrete suicidal ideation. Categories in which they could be located. We talked about many of them, involving postures of the body, for example, as well. But that situation does not mirror our needs often. With most system science models and agent-based models, compartmental models certainly fall into this category. While we sometimes deal with categorical states, often we're dealing with a state of the world that we're interested in inferring, and trying to probe, trying to understand, trying to get a best guess of, which is continuous in nature, meaning we could have more or less of something. It's not just we're in state A, B, or C. We could have more people are susceptible and fewer infectives, or vice versa, etc. So we have continuous underlying states. And we saw some of those models in the afternoon. Yeah, presented a model with measles and another one with pertussis. Some of them had just maybe 4 states in them, each of which could have values that could range continuously up to the size of the population. But some of her models, like her model with which had 32 age groups, had hundreds and hundreds of stocks associated with it, hundreds and hundreds of state variables. And we're interested in inferring that underlying situation. In addition, the Markov model was subject to, was constrained to, was straitjacketed to have fixed transition probabilities amongst the different states. Regardless of how long you've been in a state, you have the same transition probably to leave. And that was something which limited its flexibility. I argued they're still very useful despite this, but in the afternoon, we were looking at model structures with Anahita and Xiaoyan's presentation, which were not so constrained. They were much more flexible. My chance of getting infected on a per, say, day basis as a susceptible with measles, if I were susceptible to measles, my chance of getting infected on a per day or per week or per month basis would not just be a fixed quantity. It would depend on the number of people out there who have measles right now. And the models that we saw in the afternoon reflected that. But they shared the underlying situation that they're depicting, a latent underlying situation evolving over time where we have imperfect information or seeking to estimate it. And where we have one or more sequences of these imperfect information coming in. And where, in fact, we have to formulate likelihood functions, which state what's the likelihood of observing something conditional on being in an underlying state, which were some of the hallmarks, indeed, of hidden Markov models. But they transitioned to particle filtering. With particle filtering, we were inferring the underlying state of the system in a more sophisticated way than we explored with hidden Markov models. With hidden Markov models, often the tradition is that you are trying to seek a privileged model that best explains the situation. And many of my students have applied this to types of problems, from outbreak detection to detection of postures, for example. Tina is applying it to deduce the underlying state of a phone with respect to whether the screen is on, recognizing that there's imperfect and somewhat idiosyncratic information about that that's only occasionally revealed. But in those cases, we're arriving at a single model estimate that we believe to be most efficacious in explaining the data. The truth is, hidden Markov models, like particle filtering, can be conducted in a much more sophisticated way. And on occasion, I've thought about having my students pursue more sophisticated investigations with them. But those weren't in evidence yesterday. But in the afternoon, in the morning, we did explore a more sophisticated method known as particle filtering. And particle filtering is a method that seeks not one true explanation into which we put all our eggs in that basket about the underlying situation. We just count on that being true. Rather, it's an exemplar of what might be called informally an ensemble method, in the sense that many competing hypotheses jostle for explaining the data that we see. We have, at any one time in this model positing some patterns of change in the world. Maybe it's patterns of infection with measles. At any one time, different particles have different hypotheses about how many people are in each stock of that model. How many people are infected or recovered or susceptible or what have you. And those different hypotheses each are associated with a weight that reflects how much that hypothesis has accorded with observed data to this point. And over time, the model runs and those particles evolve. In between times where observations come in, the particles just run forward in the model as solitudes from each other. each one is just put through the normal dynamics of the model. They evolve over time. And then when a new observation comes in, that is where the extra mechanism comes in. We will adjust the weight of the particle. We'll see some of the details of that this morning to reflect how well it accords with this new data point in addition to the old ones. Particles that posit an underlying situation that's more consistent with what we observe in that new data point will be upweighted. Their weight will be increased. We'll reward them. We'll say, you know, you've done a great job in predicting this. We'll upweight your weight to reward you for your good prediction. Models that or particles that mispredict what should be going on. Maybe there's a particle that thinks there's very, very few susceptibles, and there's an observation of a lot of infections. That particle would have its weight dinged. It would have its weight decreased, and it would become a sort of a particle non grata. It would be a particle that's seen as not very competitive, not very fit in light of the data. So we upweight the weight of particles that accord with the data, that are consistent with the data, that jive with the new data point. We downweight particles that are inconsistent with the data. And then, on an occasional basis, there'll be what's called a resampling process, whereby particles that are too low weight get weeded out, and those that are high weight get multiplied. And that's according to something called multinomial resampling. So we basically have n particles going into it and n particles coming out of it, and all we do is a multinomial draw from the particles with a probability of associated with each given by its weight. I may mutter about that more later, but for those interested in the underlying implementation, it's multinomial draw in character. But what this means is that over time, there's a survival of the fittest of particles, where fitness is determined by how much they accord with the data. So we have many competing hypotheses for what's going on in the world, and the ones that are consistent time after time are multiplied heavily. Those that are, sometimes consistent are still likely to hang in there, and things that are in non-competitive hypotheses die out quickly. And over time, as observation comes in, it hones our understanding of what the underlying situation is. What the underlying situation is in terms of states, but also what the underlying situation is in terms of some parameter values that evolve over time. So we saw this yesterday for several models, and Xiaoyan presented a couple herself with particles, with pertussis and with measles. Each one having an aggregate model, and in fact several different age-structured models created. And Anahita showed us a model for influenza, one of several that she's worked on very successfully, been the key lead for. Those models were distinguished from each other by some features. Xiaoyan worked with some historical data of considerable length involving pertussis and measles, and demonstrated how a model could be used to account for these patterns historically. At any one point, like any particle filter model, it's seeking to reconstruct the full state of the system at that time with the multiple continuous variables that are involved. How many people at a given time were susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered with respect to measles, and potentially so at different age groups. She was able to show how a model like that, by virtue of its ability to estimate what's going on at a given time, estimate the full latent state of the system, and can be used to project forward with uncanny accuracy sometimes, with very significant accuracy, what's likely to be coming down the pike in the next 6 months. sometimes as long as a year or two. Although each of those pathogens, each of those associated illnesses with pertussis and with measles was subject to some different challenges for anticipating what's coming. But that projection that she was doing, this is a key point, ladies and gentlemen. The projection that she was doing was not based on any sort of curve fitting of the number of cases of infection in the past. No, it wasn't based on that. That dependence on observables alone, that's somewhat impoverished in terms of understanding what's going on. Curve fitting doesn't get us very far typically in real-world complex systems. And the types of systems Shaliano or Anita we're looking at, it doesn't cut it much. Operating in terms of observables and trying to connect the dots, or trying to project forward, extrapolate. Those sort of naive approaches tend to fall flat and sometimes very painfully flat when conducted with nonlinear systems, with complex systems, such as we're routinely struggling with in a public health front. Rather, her projections were based on, grounded in a reconstruction of the underlying state of a complex system, which allowed it to capture the fact of the underlying dynamics of that system, the underlying logic of that system. So when she projected forward, it was not on the basis of some sort of curve fitting, but a grounded understanding of what the underlying situation is that's mechanistic in character, and that allowed her to recognize, well, as more people get infected, the number of susceptibles will be drained and the number of infectives will rise, but then people will recover. And that leads to a much, much more robust accounting for what's likely to happen going forward. This ain't no traditional curve fitting. This is based on a grounded mechanistic understanding of the structure of the system, a capacity to reconstruct that underlying system, reconstruct the state of the underlying system, and a look forward based on that. That's much more powerful than simply connecting the dots and trying to extrapolate, which is a fool's errand when it comes to real-world complex systems. Now, in Anahita's case, her model was recommended by a notable innovation, to wit, the incorporation of a data source traditionally neglected in epidemiological investigation, which is the use of online search data that might indicate not whether one person is sick, but whether they are concerned about illness, whether they have anxiety, perhaps, or a degree of consternation about that illness. And she complemented clinical data of rigorous character with data that would normally be considered somewhat unseemly, if I might say so, in the health research sphere. Data from searches online of uncertain provenance, of uncertain implications. But what she showed was provocative, as befits the nature of work in complex systems, which challenges rating shibboleths. Specifically, she showed that whilst one could attempt reconstruction of the underlying state of the system with traditional data sources, with data sources that are based on observations from clinical data of higher caliber, the capacity of the model to operationally anticipate what lay forward, to project forward effectively, was greatly compromised with that data. It offered a pale cipher compared to what was possible when one brought in the data from online communicational behavior, from search data as well. She found adding search data, well, data of a lower quality level, it actually very materially improved the ability of the model to make sense of what was observed and to project forward, not just project forward the number of searches that are likely to take place, but indeed the number of incident cases likely to come about over the next period of time. So she found that somewhat counterintuitively for those used to thinking in a linear way about things, adding in a lower quality data source can improve the quality of the output. That again is a provocative finding, but it's one that's reflected in the underlying truth of the situation, that we're adding in information. Yes, on a per data point basis, the information is limited compared to the quality of original clinical data sets. On the other hand, it unquestionably contains added information. It's added information about another part of that system. Another part of that system concerning people's behavior, concerning their likelihood of exposing themselves to flu, or their concerns about exposing themselves to flu, which proved very instrumental in explaining the patterns that we see in predicting forward. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, I would argue that all too often in health and other cognate fields, we have crucified an understanding of the world upon the cross of easy measurability. We have privileged things that are all too often easy to measure, and not collected at all, or collected only in a limited way. Types of information which could lend great insight to the situation, but relate to aspects of human behavior that are harder to characterize, harder to measure with confidence. And yet, in the sphere of health outcomes, human behavior is writ large as a determiner of effective of some of the drivers of outcomes, whether it's looking beyond the efficacy of a vaccine as measured in tightly scripted clinical trials that control for many of the real world things that vary in day-to-day life, or whether it's and looking beyond that to ask about the degree to which people will actually go for the vaccine, or the concerns of the vaccine, or whether it's aspects of thinking about HIV spread, where we need to broaden our understanding of the biomedical understanding of HIV to an understanding of patterns of risk behavior, perception of risk, people's reaction to the availability of drugs that make HIV less of an immediate death sentence, but have impact on elements of risk taking. We need to recognize that human behavior and other aspects of human perception and belief are often of key importance in anticipating what lies forward. And all too often, data sets that would give us those insights have been shunted aside in favor of data sets from very tightly controlled circumstances, like randomized clinical trials, that are precise in their measurement, but so tightly conscripted as to provide us limited insight into real-world impact in terms of effectiveness. So particle filtering here provided us a way to incorporate not just the highest quality clinical data sets, but lower quality data sets that added information. And the statistics literature recognizes the value of data that has greater degree of variability as contributing information and indeed contributing to estimation, even though it is of lower quality. And Anahita's particle filtering, by incorporating that, was able to achieve much greater predictive capacity. I hope that those exercises, and it was not merely a hope, it was an observation of encouragement, that a lot of the questions surrounding these case studies seem to recognize the manifest value of the fact of viewing different data sets, longitudinal data sets here, observations over time, not as solitudes, not as fragmented sets of observations, each in their own world, but as relating to their different faces of a common underlying latent situation. It's like this in the world. It's not merely like this for population level issues, as Anahita and Xiaoyan examined. It's like this if we want to understand a whole person as well at the case management level. If we're dealing with a youth under protection, if we're dealing with a criminal justice issue and a possible offender, if we're dealing with a person struggling with the burden of opioids, often any one type of measurement will fall short in our understanding about what's likely occurring. We may try to guess about what's occurring from some of those measurements. Some of them might bring out salient factors. But what we'd really like to have is a more rich picture of what's going on in this person's situation more broadly. What are their underlying states of ideation? What are their possible triggers in terms of turning them towards pro-social or anti-social companionships? What are some of the factors that are shaping their underlying behavior in terms of those aspects, or in terms of those aspects of socialization or aspects of their environment? To what degree are treatment mechanisms or counseling mechanisms or social worker visits nudging them towards the better? This is not something we can undertake with any one sort of data in isolation. It's something that multiple sources of data we hope will help us triangulate, help us understand what that underlying situation is, and from a multidimensional perspective. And what I presented yesterday should be thought-provoking in that area as well. Because we're dealing with a depiction here, ladies and gentlemen, with these systems models that I introduced in the first day, not of the pieces of the elephant in isolation, not of the trunk over here with its data set and the leg over there with its data set in isolation, but rather these are models of the entire elephant. And we have bits of data on the different pieces of the elephant that try to help us understand what's going on internally. The analogy I gave 2 days ago, which some may remember, despite all of my droning since then. Just gonna have a good time talking with Christine throughout the day here today. These models that we're dealing with depict these complete underlying situations, and I argue that they allow us to reason about an underlying situation where we have only imperfect information on certain parts, but they depict the underlying latent factors and their evolution over time. And what we saw yesterday was a systematic way with particle filtering of inferring that underlying situation given the evidence and regrounding the model in the current understanding of the situation, reflecting that without that regrounding, the model will grow increasingly divergent from a situation in the world. Here, we are regrounding it so that the model incorporates the latest understanding of what's going on so that we can look forward effectively. And so that we can ask what-if questions about what would help improve the situation in the greatest way. It's this ability to leverage data science to infer that underlying situation in a system science model that provides us such power. And that is the noble task that we are pursuing this week. It's exploring these methods to bring together the insights from data science with the capacity to characterize the evolution of the world from system science, to bring them together not merely in an additive way, but in a synergistic way, to achieve the greatest potential of health. Okay? So those models we saw yesterday, while at a population level, they're beginning you to think, could we depict things at an individual level in that way? Could we knit together multiple lines of data to illuminate what's going on? The example I gave was this CT scan or an MRI scan, where from the world, we only have very imperfect data. We have data from different angles and slices from the CT scan. Slide into it. It sort of takes X-rays from different angles of you. Each of those X-rays is very limited. It only depicts a certain cross-section of the body, and there's occlusion from propagation of the rays. They can't go past certain bones or metal inserts, and so it casts shadows. And any one of those images is terribly, terribly limited. It's terribly, terribly incomplete. But what emerges from many of them, knit together by other data science techniques, is a three-dimensional picture. A three-dimensional picture of the underlying structure. Our system science techniques of particle filtering give that to us, but they give it to us more than that. They give it to us jointly with the system science model over time that allows us to see, as it were, in 3D, the beating heart of the systems that are driving the spread of measles or driving suicidal ideation on the part of an individual. Okay, so this is the unity that we are seeking to achieve. And I hope that in the course of the week, this vision will inspire you as much as it inspires me. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap up my retrospective remarks, florid though they are, with those comments. Are there any questions that might have come out of the past few days of work, recognizing that my answering your questions and addressing your needs is the foremost goal of this boot camp? Questions? Challenges? Yes?
I was trying to figure out the particles, these hypotheses.
Yes.
Are they, so the reaction is that it kind of was just kind of like a uniform distribution. But are they ever based on like previous history or other data? Like I'm thinking about like if you're modeling someone's health trajectory.
Yep.
Would you get the hypotheses from other people's health trajectories?
Good question. Good question. So the particle. So at a given time in the model, the distributions we see for particles are shaped by two primary factors, with a third entering in, particularly early in the model. One factor is the evolution, the logic of the underlying system science model itself. Each particle, it's like not far from here, over on Yonder Bridge. If you were to bring, the small trace of path, an arc is driven by the underlying flows of water. Each particle is like that in the model. If you put it in place at a given time, it will evolve according to the logic of the model until the next observation. There's nothing other than the logic of the model that sends it swirling this way or that in terms of the evolution of its value. And so the logic of the model is a big shaper of what we see in terms of the particle values. But beyond that, another key shaper is what happens at the observations. Because what happens at the observations is that some particles are upweighted and some particles are downweighted. Some particles are rewarded because they've been consistent with the data, and others are downweighted. And essentially what you saw on their screens, on the screens of Shadian or on the screens of Anikita, were samples from those particles. So particles that are very low weights were very unlikely to be samples. particles that had high weights would have been sampled a lot. So those bands, those kind of density plots, those histograms, if you would slice them in time, consider them for that time, they're a histogram. Those 2D histograms is the technical term for them in the package. Those actually result also, they're shaped heavily by the observed data, right? And so the particles essentially that are consistent with the data are the ones that are well represented. And that's why they hug the data so well. So Xiaoyan showed how with measles, as the measles cases go up and down empirically, the particles that are consistent with that are well rewarded, and hence they have high weights, and therefore those bands around those blue bands that were around the red particles were indicative of the particles that were highly weighted at that point. And finally, particles are affected by the initial distribution. And you noted there were some uniform distributions used. The only place uniform distributions would be used would be for the initial state. And so those patterns that we saw there, that you see, the patterns that emerge over time, they're coming from those three different sources. You were asking, could we inform those particles, for example, let's say in their initial state, by data from other patients? Yes, I think actually that would be a fine source. Because right now, the initial state of the model, like when we start those models off, the particles are scattered. They have the same weight. We don't have any evidence that just one is more highly weighted than the other. And they are scattered over uniform intervals for many of their initial values. And Xiaoyan didn't really show this, but she spent a great many hours at times trying to craft an initial state that is consistent with what's observed. And I suspect Anahita may have done the same. So there, data from another individual could be really helpful to give a best early guess as to what's going on, at the initial state. Often, the initial state of the model is often kind of the neglected stepchild of the situation with the dynamic model, because after that, the logic of the model takes care of shaping things, but at the initial state, we often have little understanding about what the patterns are, and so of the latent situation. So we just scatter a bunch of things in there according to crude mechanisms like uniform distributions. The effects of those die out over time as the model logic, the inexorable logic of the model takes over. But I could imagine a really nice use of data from another patient, which would basically give you a more informed understanding about what's likely going on at the initial time. So that would be very, very good. It's a very good idea. I've actually not stopped to consider that, but I like it very much. Yeah. Did that answer some of your questions? Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
So just on that kind of, or moving off of that, if we had a model, for example, that was developed for different patients, but then say there are different etiologies.
Yes.
Would it be actually possible to move backward then? And if certain models tend to be the most suitable, it could allow us to inform us to identify what the different etiologies would be for different populations, or given certain information that we get on different people, essentially.
So thank you for that question. This idea of helping to identify an underlying etiology associated, say, with a pathology in a given patient, based on which model most accords with or can best account for their conditions, is indeed, in my view, a very good use of these methods. And I would argue a very realistic use of these methods. It is also a use which has, to my knowledge, not yet seen use, and which would be very attractive. And I believe these methods would be very responsive to it. I would just put out there one counter question, which or one observation about something I would think about, having built now a dozen or so of these models for different needs, or 12 to 15 of them, different areas, 12 to 15 different areas. In my view, when we have different etiologies, so when we're thinking about etiologies, we're thinking about different mechanisms of disease, different mechanisms of the underlying pathology. And there's a question in my mind about the degree to which you'd want to use different types of dysfunction pathologically, or whether indeed you might, within a single model, depicting multiple pathways that are relevant to this disease. Pathologies different pathologies could be represented by different parameter values in that model. So you might have one pathology which is associated with this type of hematological disorder. So megalothrombocytopenia, and another one associated with anemia, and another one associated with some type of morphological disorder, maybe a specific type of sickle cell anemia. And I can imagine within the same model, you just adjusting parameters to represent different etiologies of disease. So in other words, it wouldn't be an entirely different model which would be needed. It would rather be the same model, but with different parameter regimes, different sort of different parameters holding different values for different pathologies. And personally, if I were to approach it, that's how I put my money down on that approach, because that allows you with a single model to infer, and I think this could be done in a quite nice way, to infer for a given patient what are the likely situation for that patient as far as pathways of disease. Okay, and one of the reasons I like this is because a given patient might have could in some cases have multiple disorders related to a single system of their body, and you could simultaneously represent a patient, with a patient who has simultaneously multiple related disorders within that single model, rather than depending on multiple models as solitude. So I think you could infer using these approaches, and some of what you saw Xiaoyan present yesterday, or to some degree on Kita as well. They're inferring the value of certain parameters in the model based on the observed data. And it's not just one parameter, it's multiple parameters. This afternoon, or tomorrow morning, as time allows, we'll be seeing a more powerful technique, you have noticed, particle Markov chain Monte Carlo, which allows estimation of latent, of static variables, or static parameters. It allows us to estimate the sample from the distribution for them, which would also be very powerful in the technique you're talking about. So not only do I think it's possible, I think it certainly is. It's feasible with these methods. It is important. It is doable, and it's underserved. So I think what you suggested there could be a very attractive application of these methods.
And as an extension to that, so would we be able to potentially use different sets of parameters to essentially identify new illnesses in its own way? So for example, for a given symptom, we have no idea what's actually causing it, and we suspect that it's multiple different causes, but we have no idea what it is, we can't actually identify it ourselves, would we be able to create a model where certain sets of parameters or certain patterns are common, and then it essentially informs us, hey, all these people are likely the same cause, and then maybe we should figure out what's causing these specific populations.
Could in principle be done. The primary uncertainty I have in answering that question is the degree of strong understanding of the biologic pathways that already exist related to this. I've done, I would say, a moderate amount of within the body modeling, physiology, much of it related to immunology and immunoepidemiology. Tina back there has done quite a bit with, for example, modeling of HIV related mechanisms. But I don't know the modeling space in that area physiologically enough to know how well is it mapped out. If it's mapped out reasonably well in terms of the requisite sort of biologic pathways, I would physiological pathways in some areas, then I would think yes, that should be possible. It's not trivial. I mean, this is not something where within a month's time you'd be able to cluster all these patients, but with a year or two of concerted work on something like that, I think you could have all sorts of insights as long as you can build on some plausible physiologic models that already exist, or that could be assembled from existing evidence or an understanding. I would think that could be a large part of a career is exploring those topics. And I would suggest that you talk with some of the grad students here, particularly Xiaoyan or Anahita or Tina, who might have additional insights. Yeah. So I think that's very exciting. I'm glad to talk with you further about it to explore what's needed. I'd also suggest Jeff back there in the back row. Jeff being an MD himself and having considerable familiarity with the physiological modeling, I'm sure might be a good point of consultation. Yeah. Question?
No question. It was a comment for his questions. So he asked if it has different data for different patients. So the general idea is you train a model for one patient, but his extension is if we can use the data set of all the patients to infer what of let's say patient A, what to improve the model. So based on my knowledge, there is a few tricks that we can do that. So the simplest way is to let's say all of them come with the same type disease, for example. So basically the underlying mechanism is the same, but each individual can have some different parameters, like they might belong to different age group or different weight, height, or something like that. But the general idea is some of the parameters might come from the same distributions. So you can either characteristic those parameters individually, or even simpler, put a random defect on those parameters, which allow you to use all the source of data to infer those parameters.
I think that it is true that you might have a model that relates to. Certainly, you'd want a model that. I mean, it's not going to be fruitful to say we're going to have a model of the human body. We'll want models that are organ. I mean, in your area, probably organ or system specific, and or might have multiple code linked systems, but that are not aspiring to a full biological accounting for human physiology. And as such, maybe you can deal with multiple sets of patient data. Generally, I'm not aware of a way that you wouldn't want to, in a given run of the particle filtering model, be feeding in data from multiple patients at a time, and like one patient first, and then the next, and then the next. Generally, be doing it for a given patient, and we have it work to infer the latent state and the parameter values for that patient. But then you might be able to cluster from what's found there, patients, and you might find that in terms of their parameters, there's several latent clusters associated with different subgroups of patients, something along those lines. So I think this would be fruitful for some more exploration offline, and I'd look forward to doing that. And we can talk further about it. Okay, additional questions or comments, things people would like to discuss? Okay. Barring that, what do you think, Christine? Should we give people a break right now? A health break for 10 minutes, and then we can come together. So we've got a couple things going on this morning, which are going to be responsive to hopefully many of your needs. Number one, we're going to be going into a little bit of exploration about how particle filtering can be implemented. If any of you want to explore some of the models that we provided, you can do so. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about, I'll probably do this first because people are a little bit more focused in the morning. Talk about building on our knowledge of particle filtering. I waved my hand to a lot of things yesterday. I want to pin some things down. You pick some things up from the case studies perhaps, but I want to make it more specific and bring home a few points. Thirdly, we'll, as the situation allows, we'll have a couple more case studies, which will give you understanding of additional ways we can apply particle filtering. Okay, so we'll break for 10 minutes now, and then we'll jump into some, maybe what I'll do is I'll show you how you can run a model that's there, and those of you who want to engage in exploratory computation can do that, but those of you who would like to focus on the lecture can do so as well. And I'll then come back to that model and show some additional features. Okay? Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you here in 10 minutes. Hi.